I think that that's important, not just symbolically that you're contesting everything that the Chinese say, but that you're willing to talk with them and have contacts and exchanges, some of which are actually very cooperative. And it's important probably within the United States, but certainly for a lot of U.S. allies and partners, that they're seeing that not all things that come out of the United States towards China are all antagonistic.
Well, hello and welcome to today's discussion hosted by the National Committee on U.S. China Relations on the Xiangshan Forum held last month in Beijing. My name is Jennifer Staats, and I'm the Director for East Asia and Pacific Programs at the United States Institute of Peace, and it is my honor to serve as the moderator for today's discussion. We are very fortunate to have two outstanding experts with us today to help guide this discussion. They were both in person at the forum in Beijing 2 weeks ago, and they are here to tell us about what happened, what they saw, and what it all means. First, we have Chad Sbragia, who's a research analyst with the Institute for Defense Analyses and the former Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for China. He served in the Marine Corps for many years, including an assignment at the U.S. Embassy in Beijing. And Dr. Fiona Cunningham is Assistant Professor of Political Science at the University of Pennsylvania. Her research interests there lie at the intersection of technology and conflict, with a particular focus on China. We're thrilled that they are both with us here today for today's discussion. Chad and Fiona, as we said, I know you were both at the forum in Beijing in person. So before we dive into the details of the Xiangshan Forum, I just want to take a quick step back because I realize that not everyone is familiar with the Xiangshan Forum. So I think maybe we'll start there. And Chad, perhaps first to you, would you please just set the stage for us by explaining a little bit about what the Xiangshan Forum is, why it exists, who attends, and why this is so important?
Sure, I'll give it a stab. I'll take a stab at it. So, as it was very clear in all the material and presentations there, that this was the 10th iteration of what's technically called the Beijing Xiangshan Forum now. Initially, it was originated by the China Association of Military Science, or CAMS, who remains a large leading role in organizing and structuring the event. I believe it began in 2006 as a track 2 event, and more oriented to Asia Pacific security dialogues rather than more global issues, where it's now at. It was later upgraded to a track 1.5 event, I think in 2013 or 2014, at the 5th forum, and that's when you started to see much greater investment by other nations, obviously, because as a track 1.5, you're bringing in a range of more sitting officials as participants, and that changed the dynamic of it pretty significantly. So now it includes defense and military leaders, security leaders, a lot of academics and thinkers more broadly, as well as international organizations, not just individual nations sending representation. So, and in the case of some former officials who now kind of continue to participate in the events there and help shape and share insights. So, Xiangshan Forum right now is hosted by several different entities, which is probably helpful to understand. One is CAMS, but also the China Institute for International Strategic Studies, or CIISS. Now that's interesting because that's a think tank, a more formal think tank that's directly associated with the PLA, specifically the Military Intelligence Department. And so it kind of gives you a flavor about what they're thinking about and how they intend to use this forum, besides just having an organization to help do so. The participants at this forum, which we might get into later in more detail, but I think that what they announced repeatedly was there was roughly 100 different nations participated. There was 6 different, substantive international organizations that participated, and nations. There was, as they stated, 60 different senior level delegates that attended this year, as part of the 100-nation kind of grouping that showed up. It's an important venue. It certainly has grown to be more important over time as it has expanded. But I think it's really important on several levels to kind of cap this piece off. Is first, kind of just at the strategic level, it's certainly symbolic of China's efforts to get out and about and showcase itself, particularly diplomatically, and certainly in terms of defense diplomacy, about showcasing where China's at, its initiatives, thoughts, and insights, how its frameworks should be viewed and understood, and more broadly, kind of promoting party initiatives and the PLA's alignment to those. At a different level, it certainly helps develop defense and security relationships that otherwise would not necessarily form. It does bring together, for U.S. participants in particular, really kind of a unique collection of personalities that you just don't normally see in more of the long-standing forums, for example, like Shangri-La. At probably a lower level, it's certainly a great opportunity for public and private messaging and signaling, learning and sharing, providing or contributing insights and collecting insights from others, and then as well as just making sure that you're kind of seen and understood in a more deliberate way that you might not be if you don't participate. So overall, it's a kind of a growing, still relatively small, but certainly increasingly important for that you'll have to pay attention to, at least if you're in the United States.
Great, thank you. And I guess I'll ask just one follow-up question on that. You have the unique distinction of being someone who attended this forum, but also attended the last forum held in person in 2019. You were then, I believe, an official representative of the U.S. government. I understand you are not that now, and you are not speaking on behalf of the U.S. government. But I wonder if you could say just a few words about how the United States has approached this forum and its participation in the forum in the past. And did you notice any real shifts between the event that you attended in 2019 and the event that you attended a few weeks ago in terms of substance, tone, atmospherics, et cetera?
Yeah, so I'll try to unpack that. So I was the first official or senior official from the Pentagon that had attended. Predominantly in the past, we had sent attaches or just private U.S. citizen scholars who aren't directly associated with the Defense Department. So that was an interesting choice to make at that time, because really since its emergence as a Track 1.5 event, I think in the United States we just didn't feel compelled to pay much attention to it. It was still relatively small. But by 2019, it was starting to grow in prominence, and it was a deliberate decision to send somebody of a little bit higher rank. So still not clearly the top rank, but more senior rank. And that was certainly symbolic for the Chinese, and we've seen that reflected. And you even saw that reflected in a lot of the media coverage at this event, which drilled straight in on the official delegation that came, but also me as a former official attending as well. So it's important for the Chinese side, I think, to kind of see that the United States is investing at least some in this event. Mm-hmm. I think the overall view from the Pentagon, not as their spokesperson or talking for them, is that there's a kind of a little bit of cautious or caution that they view this fora through, because why would you want to invest or provide any energy to this platform that's distinctly and almost exclusively driven by China's agenda and perspectives? So I think that the counterpoise to that is why give free space to anybody that might be messaging things that are inimical to your own perspectives. Go in and talk. You have to kind of get in the ring, particularly as we now characterize it as strategic competition. Well, competition means you get in the ring and you have to kind of fight. And I think that's important, not just symbolically that you're contesting everything that the Chinese say, but that you're willing to talk with them and have contacts and exchanges, some of which are actually very cooperative. And it's important probably within the United States, but certainly for a lot of U.S. allies and partners, that they're seeing that not all things that come out of the United States towards China are all antagonistic. There actually are opportunities to do so. I will highlight one significant change, which is it just felt much darker in Beijing this time, not just physically, but intellectually. The isolation over the last few years, particularly because of COVID, I think that made a lot of the America watchers or Western watchers in China become very isolated in their perspectives. And it really demonstrated the need for them to ensure that they have contacts and exchanges where they're getting direct communication on insights or strategic thinking from others. And that was certainly one of my big takeaways of just how distorted even this relatively small span of time has made China's strategic analysis. I thought that there was some pretty significant problems with that. It also coincides with a pretty significant shift in China's perspective about changes in the strategic landscape. And so the combination of those two, I think, showcased that, there is certainly mounting tensions, and they're going to intensify here over time.
Thanks. And we're definitely going to come back to this question about the U.S.-China relationship and U.S.-China tensions. But first, again, I just want to kind of establish the bigger picture and go to Fiona to talk a little bit about what else has been going on in terms of China's engagement with the world. This is obviously not the only big meeting that China has hosted or attended recently. There's been a real flurry of multilateral diplomacy. And can you just help us put the Xiangshan Forum in the context of some of these other big events in Chinese diplomacy?
So thanks, Jennifer. I think what was very striking for me, and I arrived to Beijing to participate in the forum actually a little bit earlier, so maybe a week or so before the forum took place, just as the BRI Forum, the Belt and Road Initiative Forum, was taking place within Beijing. And so this was an opportunity for countries that are members of China's Belt and Road Initiative, this very large multilateral China-led attempt to provide infrastructure financing to the globe, but with a particular emphasis to China's west and towards the global south, was taking place. And that initiative, that meeting, was attempting to sort of re-energize China's leadership on the development and the economic front of its foreign policy agenda. So that preceded the Xiangshan Forum by only approximately 10 days. There were posters all over Beijing for that initiative. And some of you might also remember that President Vladimir Putin also personally attended the BRI Forum and gave an address there as well. So you had this, I think, really interesting sequencing taking place between having an economically development-oriented major kind of international forum preceding the Xiangshan Forum by about 10 days or so. And that was referenced, I think, repeatedly in some of the keynote addresses by certainly Chinese officials and military leaders during the Xiangshan Forum as sort of indicating the way in which China's foreign policy an engagement with the globe was not just a defense and security issue, but it was also providing these kinds of development and economic leadership and benefits. So both of those two things were sort of brought together, if you like, as major events in China's diplomatic and engagement calendar, but also themes in terms of what China was able to sort of provide in terms of its global leadership. And of course, we've seen just, I think, this week, China attending the APEC forum here in the United States. So having these two sort of, if you like, international fora hosted by Beijing, and then the APEC forum in particular focused on the Asia Pacific region and the economic side of things, but then providing this very important opportunity in the bilateral relationship between the United States that I would say has almost in some ways outweighed any of the broader significance of the APEC summit, is bringing the US and Chinese leaders together in person as being that sort of important step forward. So seeing seeing this sequencing from being global leadership then to managing this particularly important bilateral relationship that was, I think, very much emphasized in the Chinese readout of the meeting between Xi and Biden, the way in which the leadership of the two countries was sort of really mission critical to the way that international politics is going to have to be managed going forward. And I think one of the themes I would just pull out that certainly came out in Xiangshan and in some of the APEC meeting readouts is this idea, this contest, if you like, between how the United States and China are presenting their bilateral relationship, with the United States viewing this idea of strategic competition and China really pushing back against this framing of strategic competition and presenting another way, if you like, of trying to manage the bilateral relationship that is not sort of presented as competitive to the rest of the world. And that was certainly, again, a key theme that you saw at Xiangshan. So the meeting, Xiangshan, just to sort of bring things back to the theme of our discussion, I think provides a through line, if you like, in some ways for these major themes in China's diplomatic engagement with regards to development, but also the management of this critical relationship with the United States.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. And I think I want to follow up a little bit on that thread of both the United States and China trying to project certain messages or share certain thoughts about the way that they view the bilateral relationship. Of course, everyone was paying very close attention to this, watching the U.S. China relationship and how the countries interacted at the forum. But they weren't just watching, they were also talking about it. And several countries in their remarks really made note of their interpretation or their perceptions of the U.S.-China relationship and what that means for them and for global stability and security. So I'm curious, either one of you, maybe Chad, start with you. What did you hear from some of the other participants in terms of how they were viewing the U.S.-China relationship, U.S.-China competition in the context of all the other issues that were being discussed at the forum?
Yeah, I'll begin with echoing Fiona's comments, which is it's best to view Xiangshan, the Beijing Xiangshan Forum, really in the context, at least this iteration, in the context of a much more sweeping set of Chinese efforts, really kind of initiatives and events that they knitted together, and it's really kind of a masterful piece of statecraft to be able to do that at such a broad level. So I think she mentioned BRI and certainly APEC, but there's tons of track 2s, track 1.5s, and other bilaterals, plus a whole host of other kind of functional or topical events that have all kind of embody this broader kind of theme. In that context, is attending the fora, I didn't see necessarily a different tone than I did in the last in-person iteration. But I did pick up that the kind of usual suspects who made up the bulk of the senior participants who spoke at the main panels, not the special sessions, is pretty hostile to the United States overall, with some rare exceptions. So the most commonly used phrase, I think, or term of art was probably hegemon. And that was the clear euphemism for the United States or U.S. and its like-minded allies and partners. And so it was almost a therapy session. It felt like it sometimes, where everybody gets 10 minutes on the mic to come up and talk about how much they hate the hegemon and how much they need to band together to resist the hegemon. So in part with that, one of the distinctions I would make from the last event was, in the end, the Chinese side has unveiled several large-scale initiatives to complement the BRI. That includes the Global Development Initiative, and a little bit more recently the Global Security Initiative, and most recently the Global Civilization Initiative. And so almost all of the main participants, or the senior participants, all echoed almost completely China's framework for its Global Security Initiative. So you heard very close alignment. And I think that's really particularly important for anybody listening to the outcomes of this, is that it wasn't just alignment in terms of participation, it was actually alignment in terms of shared visions for a future global security framework, as the PLA will often characterize that as global governance or global security governance, right, for the international system. I think that really matters. And that's really, if you're talking about competition, that's where the competition space is. So I also agree with Fiona that, China is trying to offer a better vision. At the same time, it's hard not to conclude that it's a competing vision and it's meant to compete. But I think that's where you have to be there. You have to ask questions and raise points. And, to the Chinese side's credit, is they allowed other voices to come on and make critiques, which I know I did in my session, and I know that others did as well. So.
Perfect. Thanks. Fiona, do you want to weigh in on this as well?
Sure. I think, and Chad said it very well, that in the plenary sessions, it was very striking the way that almost every one of the kind of senior defense officials were pointing out and referencing things like the Global Security Initiative, Global Development Initiative, Global Civilizational Initiative. So there was much sort of, reference to, if you like, these frameworks that China had been putting forward. But more subtly, I think what was interesting to me listening to those sessions was the way in which referencing often these Chinese initiatives then actually created opportunities for speakers that were coming from countries in Africa and Latin America, in the Indo-Pacific region, to present things that could sort of provide content for those initiatives, which are very sort of lofty in their goals and a little bit light on the details, that they wanted to see China do as a leading power in international affairs. So it was very striking the way a number of countries were referencing climate change, or they were referencing internal security and terrorism, or they would be referencing questions of disinformation and artificial intelligence. So using in some ways the opportunity presented by being there at the Xiangshan Forum to suggest the kinds of things that they wanted China to be paying attention to in the kind of global governance space. So I guess that one of the things I wasn't expecting to see, but that I noticed in the course of the forum, and was the way in which showing up for some of those country representatives and sort of, if you like, referencing those Chinese initiatives was also a vehicle through which they could get their asks to China as a great power for what they wanted to see China do in the world across very clearly and very significantly. And one other thing I'll just note here as well is that I think the PRC media coverage of the forum was another very striking aspect of this. So this is also an opportunity for other countries and persons who are attending that forum to get views across to the Chinese domestic audience in ways that it was often extremely difficult to without that kind of a very high level, very high profile, very sort of media saturated environment. So I was sort of seeing that there was a two-way street in some ways going on, in which other countries were using this opportunity, if you like, to ensure their voices were heard by the Chinese leader, the Chinese people, and the Chinese elites, who were, the kind of key audiences for the forum.
Great, thanks. And Fiona, will stick with you. I think another country that certainly made the most of this opportunity to be present and be seen and be heard was Russia. Russia is, of course, being shunned by much of the international community for its illegal and unjustified war in Ukraine. But the story was very different at the Xiangshan Forum, where Russia really played a central role in the event and seemed to really receive some pretty strong support from the Chinese hosts. So I wonder if you could just help us understand a little better how Russia fits into this equation. Who attended, what role did Russia play, and what does this tell us about the China-Russia strategic partnership?
So, of course, the headliner for, if you like, once the opening ceremony had taken place, the very first guest speaker at the plenary was Sergei Shoigu, the Russian defense minister, who provided a fairly lengthy keynote address in which, among other things, he presented sort of conditions under which Russia would be willing to have peace talks, which suggested openness, but sort of signaled that certain preconditions would have to be fulfilled that seemed to sort of close the door, if you like, but also then to present a certain vision or narrative of why the Ukraine war had taken place, and the way in which Western intervention in it had led to greater escalation. So really sort of used the opportunity that he had to be able to present this particular narrative of the way in which the conflict had taken place, and to lay the blame for doing so fairly squarely at the feet of the United States and NATO. And I guess the way in which I interpreted this is the PRC continuing to provide Russia with a role and a platform and a sort of opportunity, if you like, to continue its influence and its engagement in global security affairs, despite the efforts of, in particular, Western countries, NATO, Europe, Japan, Australia, etc., to try and deny some of that space to Russia, given the events taking place within Ukraine. But I would notice that despite the way in which China and Russia in some ways both presented deep concerns in their opinions about things the United States was doing in the world, I didn't necessarily see that concordance of interest go kind of right the way down to the details. So to give an example, in that kind of plenary session, the Russian foreign defense minister was very explicit in his critiques of the way that the United States had damaged Russian security interests in ways that provoked the conflict, while Zhang Youxia, one of the vice chairman of the Central Military Commission, who was hosting, if you like, the event on behalf of the PLA and the PRC, didn't explicitly mention the United States, sort of obliquely referenced hegemons sort of stirring up trouble and provoking tensions where there didn't need to be. So even just the manner in which the two countries were expressing their opposition to what they see as the US's role in international politics was a little bit different in that sort of level of directness. But at a layer below that, sometimes in the course of sessions and discussions, you would have Russian experts who would be impaneled. They would often come with very different perspectives to Ukrainian experts who would also be impaneled. So in some ways, the organizers were giving both Russian and Ukrainian experts the opportunity to sort of say their piece, and specifically to say their piece often to a PRC audience. One of the areas where I was seeing some daylight, if you like, between the Russia-China alignment was in the nuclear space. One of the themes that came out, and this is obviously because this is an area that I work on, but one of the themes that came out to me across that doom and gloom sort of atmosphere, if you like, that Chad referred to, was constant reference to the rising nuclear risks, the risks of proliferation, the risks of nuclear war, and the way that they were increasing through many participants. But when it came to discussing the specifics of those nuclear risks and issues, some of the Russian experts and some of the Chinese experts were on quite different pages about them. Some of the Russian experts were sort of talking quite explicitly about the need to make sure that the credibility of nuclear deterrence of Russia towards NATO was restored through fairly forward-leaning policies and strategies for nuclear weapons, but also in some ways warning China not to build its nuclear forces up too much. And on the Chinese side, you had this greater concern about risks of nuclear weapons use and a constant reiteration of this idea that nuclear war cannot be won and should not be fought. So you're sort of starting to see bits of daylight emerge between the two countries. So my broader takeaway is that the level of Russia-China alignment, if you like, it's sort of pitched at a level that is general enough that the two countries can agree that there is a common cause against some of the US policies that both dislike, but that allows them to sort of paper over or avoid really delving into the details of what they dislike, as well as how they might actually view each other's actions, whether it's in Ukraine, in the nuclear space, and in other areas. So I sort of see this continued alignment sort of, but at a level of generality that avoids the conflict or the differences of opinion to really come to light in that relationship.
Thanks. That was terrific and really insightful. Chad, did you want to add anything on either the Russia issue or nuclear issue or any of the other kind of substantive topics that came up in the panels that you saw?
No, I'll echo to provide an anecdotal piece of evidence that to dovetail into what Fiona said is at the previous Xiangshan Forum, the Russian defense minister also had the place of prominence as the very first speaker. first non-PLA speaker. And a good portion of his discussion was linked to that period of time where the Russians had made a choice to develop and ultimately field capacities that led to the abrogation of the INF Treaty. Now, that's a significant issue just in terms of stability between the United States and Russia, but one of the effects of that is it had served as a restraint on the United States from building military systems, basically longer range, or at least medium range, intermediate range missile systems. Now, this had been a pretty significant strategic advantage to the PLA, who have built, as the record shows, thousands of these kind of these weapon systems, and the United States possessing none. And so his pitch at that fora was, well, the INF Treaty is now gone. However, maybe the United States and Russia can reach a deal where we agree to hold the INF in place in the Asia Pacific and keep this abrogation limited only to Europe. And really that was a signal that the Chinese were probably pretty upset with the Russians that they had let that INF Treaty lapse, now freeing the United States to compete with these longer range missile systems, taking away a pretty significant advantage of the Chinese. So it's just, as a snapshot of that there are significant things that come from these kind of forums that you might not get at other places, and particularly as a snapshot of the delicacies and kind of undercurrent of deeper Russia-China relations that really matter here. So I really kind of applaud Fiona for encapsulating that, but also to give kind of a personal example of that. So didn't see that as much this time in terms of Russian outreach, but to the U.S., but certainly those undercurrents, as Fiona explained, continue and merit more scrutiny and close watching. So.
Wonderful. Well, thank you both. We'll end with three shorter questions that I will pose to both of you. Maybe Chad will start with you and then go to Fiona, at least on this first one. But I guess the first is just kind of taking back to the big picture. What does all of this mean? What did the 2023 Beijing Xiangshan Forum accomplish? And, what do you think its legacy will be as we look back at this point in time over the next few years?
But go ahead, Fiona.
Okay, so I'll start with a couple of things that I think to me were really, I think in hindsight we'll look back on this forum and remark on. The first is that I think that this is part of China, the long tail of China's exit, if you like, from the isolation of its zero COVID policies and re-engagement with the world, and obviously re-engagement on slightly different terms to that on which it disengaged in 2020 when the pandemic began. And so I think we'll look back and see that this is one of the important sort of first steps in particular in getting the People's Liberation Army military diplomacy and engagement out of that sort of period and back into conversation with a lot of international experts and other sort of official engagements. So that's, I think, one thing that's very important. The second thing that I think we will probably remark from this is the way in which the PRC is now setting the narrative of its foreign policy in the place of security, alongside, in particular, development in its foreign policy priorities. And I think it remains to be seen whether this is a reflection of the kind of comprehensive national security concept that Xi Jinping has put forward, seeing foreign and domestic security as being very much interlinked, and therefore development and security as being interlinked, and also the way in which China's foreign policy is really, I think, emphasizing greater cooperation and collaboration with Latin America, Africa, the Middle East, and more towards the global South, if you like. But I think it will also perhaps be remembered in as much as I think the kind of U.S. message wasn't present at the forum, and the U.S. was sort of painted as being a force for no good in the world. in some ways, this forum did preview a return to better U.S.-China defense relations for me. Zhang Youxia, the CMC vice chairman, certainly mentioned the re-engagement in his remarks. In one of the nuclear sessions, one of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs officials who spoke also described increasing U.S.-China engagement on some nuclear issues, which we subsequently saw last week. And so I think that's another, kind of key turning point that we will see is perhaps, again, as confirmed by the readouts from the APEC summit meeting yesterday, that this is, reopening, if you like, the U.S.-China mill engagements. They would be sort of three pieces that I would point to.
That was terrific. Chad, do you have anything to add to that or any other major takeaways from the forum that you'd like to share?
Yeah, I'll just echo Fiona's for all of those. I would add one is that just struck me as just how confident the Chinese were. I think some of that because they have actually more substantive initiatives now that they can in framework. So they're definitely promoting a much more clear agenda, exactly as Fiona laid that out. But both the that they hadn't doing so, but also which seems contradictory, which is not a problem in China, to hold two diametrically opposing thoughts at the same time. But their confidence was actually shaded a little bit by concern about the increasing kind of chaos in the strategic landscape, as she talks about the two situations and the changes unseen in a century, these kind of this impending emerging turmoil. But the Chinese having a lot of confidence that they have the things in place, or at least are maturing them to kind of make it through there. And it's going to take more investment in the security efforts on the international stage. So.
Wonderful. Thank you. Well, we have time for one more question. You have both shared some really incredible, thoughtful, and insightful takeaways and observations from the event. I just want to give you one more chance. Was there anything that you noticed at the forum or something that you found to be really interesting or important that really hasn't been a focus of the media coverage or official reporting or conversation coming out of the event? Is there anything we're missing that you think deserves more attention?
So I might start with one quick observation, or rather two sort of short but interrelated observations. I think on the one hand, I was struck by the way in which China convening a forum, as I mentioned already, provides other countries with an opportunity to present what they want out of their relationship with China to look like. But also I think it demonstrated in some ways this unique position China is in, where you can have like NATO and North Korean official representatives that are milling in the same halls. It's an unusual combination to have the different types of countries that you wouldn't ordinarily see sort of mixing and engaging with each other, doing so, or at least having the opportunity to knock heads in the hallways at Xiangshan. So to me, that was something that I think demonstrates perhaps the potential China has to cross boundaries between aspects or opponents in the world who might not otherwise talk to each other.
Great, thanks. Chad, any last words from you?
I think we've actually covered the ones that I would prioritize, and then particularly Fiona as well. I'll add one to it, which is certainly China has had great concern about increasing European and particularly NATO interest in security in the region, not just globally, but specific to the Indo-Pacific. Yet Zhang Youxia, I think, said it directly. He goes, one of our priorities is to do more defense relations outreach to Europe, and he named Europe specifically. I think that kind of gives you a clue that where they feel like that they're making headway and where they're not, and the place that they feel like they need to do better at and increase at least the level of effort towards is Europe. And so that might give a hint at where you might see the shift in what the Chinese would call their diplomatic discourse system, particularly their military discourse system, and their efforts to kind of unhinge that from where it's currently at.
Wonderful. Thank you. Well, thank you to our audience for tuning in for this incredible discussion today. Thank you to our two wonderful panelists, Dr. Fiona Cunningham and Chad Sbragia, and special thanks to the National Committee on U.S.-China Relations for making this discussion possible. Again, this was a real treat. I learned a ton and really appreciate your taking the time to share your thoughts with us today. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.